Hello, everybody, and welcome to our session today, in which we want to talk about digitalization, specifically in the area of FX management, currency management, building a digital FX function for 2022. Welcome, everybody. My name is Michael Schimmel. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Kantox. And in my role, I have the opportunity to speak to quite a lot of treasurers with companies in all industries and also in terms of size, of all sizes. And therefore, I know that this is really a quite actual topic that is top of your mind in many companies. How can the treasury department digitalize more and specifically in this area of currency management? I'm very glad today that I have my colleague with me, Nadia Corbett. She's leading our efforts in the UK, and she's a very competent finance professional with a strong background also from auditing, and has also a wealth of experience discussing exactly that topic of how to set up best hedging programs in all kinds of industries with their clients. So Nadia, thank you for being with me today, and let's jump right into it.
Perfect. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, here we go. Digitalization as a trend in the finance department. I have to say, I don't think that digitalization in finance is really a new trend at all. I mean, probably it's fair to say that the finance departments, the finance teams, the CFO teams are probably on the forefront of software usage in companies, leveraging solutions like ERP solutions, accounting and consolidation solutions, treasury management solutions. Since many years, this is nothing new, and those professionals in those areas fulfill most of their daily tasks nowadays already with bespoke software that is fit for purpose. If you think about, for example, financial consolidation, I don't think a lot of companies do this with an Excel sheet anymore. Everybody has a specific solution that at the end allows you to publish a balance sheet and profit and loss statement or your annual report. So other solutions that we see a lot out there for larger companies, for example, using trading platforms like 360T or FXall, or within treasury also many companies are using already solutions to do mass payments and to automate those processes. Now, that is interesting that there is one area where this kind of automation through fit-for-purpose software has absolutely not taken place yet, which is exactly FX risk management. And this is also why we believe this workshop today is quite interesting, because that is, if you look at the priorities that treasurers have, and if you look at the latest survey that was published recently by the E-Act, where it says that both digitalization as well as risk management are among the top 3 priorities for treasurers and for CFOs. So we are really speaking about a hot topic across the board in the treasury departments, in all kinds of companies. Why is that? It is because nowadays, you can see it here, there is still this bubble with the Excel logo on it, the spreadsheet logo. It is because this is an area, FX risk management, where companies really rely still very heavily on complex Excel sheets and a lot of manual work. And of course, this has all its downturns, and probably maybe some of you have been basically in the spotlight now during the last 2 years, since we have to face a COVID crisis and we need to rearrange ourselves working from home, not being together in the office anymore. And this whole change of the working environment has spotlighted and shown for many companies the vulnerability of processes that are not robust, that are relying on a lot of manual tasks on spreadsheets and are not solidly implemented through software solutions and automated there. So I think we could say that the whole COVID situation has emphasized the criticality of automating FX risk management even more. Now, I need to switch the slide. If we want to take a look, how does the world look today for, I would say, almost all companies that we speak to about this topic? We see a world where, as mentioned before, spreadsheets, Excel are the tool that are used. And obviously, this is not designed at all to manage FX risk, which results in very complex sheets that we often see that the treasurer, the FX trader have to manipulate in a manual way with all the operational risk that come with that. When I say that this is what we mostly see, then maybe I want to give one specific emphasis on what we do see it with very large companies, though, is that they are using some of the solutions. I already mentioned that trading platforms when it comes to actually doing the trade. And then maybe they even have some integration with post-trade, with a TMS system to bring back the trade information into a TMS system. But the process that I'm speaking about here is really the pre-trade process, where we can clearly say that 99% of companies have no solution in place nowadays, rely on those Excel solutions to gather exposure data, to understand it, and then taking hedging decisions. All of that very manual, often having to wrestle with a lack of the data, of quality in the data, in the exposure data. So very difficult to understand the constantly evolving exposure of the company. And having to deal with multiple inputs of data. Some comes through downloads from an ERP, then some comes through emails or through other Excel sheets that are being sent. So it's really a very challenging world that a treasurer lives in to make sense of all of this data, assure quality, and doing all of that without any manual errors, which of course pose quite a significant operational risk. These suboptimal processes and resources are then often leading to, let's say, an inappropriate or ineffective hedging program in place, in which the risk is not really perfectly under control. It is somehow under control. There is, in most cases, a hedging program, and this is being followed as good as possible in a manual way. But it's often not ideal to really be the best program available for the specific business dynamic that a certain company has, or maybe that even a certain business unit has. What we also see a lot is that given that complexity and given the cumbersome manual work that we often see, is that companies try to avoid using currencies wherever they can. So they are using fewer currencies that they maybe actually should in order to provide a better experience to their clients or to their suppliers and to optimize the usage of foreign currencies. So I think it's fair to say that we are given the constraints that the tool, the Excel tool and the manual works impose on the treasurers, they have to, as a result, often live with a suboptimal hedging program, or maybe sometimes even no hedging program at all. This is also something we come across, that companies sometimes don't hedge at all just because of this complexity in the whole process. Now, how should the world look like? And in our view, there is a clear methodology that should take place, that should be used to come to the optimal hedging program and then ideally automate everything. And it all starts with your business characteristics and your goals as a company, and also your goals when it comes to leveraging FX. Because those really determine what is the optimal program for your company or for your business unit. And let me give you an example. Let's imagine we are a manufacturing company and we are selling very complex machinery that we build bespoke for our clients. So that core part of the business where you negotiate with the client a contract and then sell that, let's say, 2-3 million piece of machinery, is from the pricing dynamics quite dynamic, because you negotiate every price, and that allows you to hedge the margin of this contract that you have calculated in when you determine the price for that machine. So it's a dynamic pricing that basically results in an optimal program, which we would call a micro hedging program on a contractual basis. Now, that same company has maybe a spare parts business. In that spare parts, they have a price list that let's say lasts for 1 year. So here we have a complete different dynamic, and this different dynamic requires a very different hedging program for that special spare parts unit. And in that program, they would more rely on forecast, how much of those spare parts are we going to sell, and then maybe have a more static program or even a layering program, depending on the forward-looking visibility that this company has. So you can see that is what should take place. But the reality is, even such a company, if they have a hedging program, probably have only one for the whole company and not two, in my example here, that are best or most effective for those two different business units I was talking about. And then, of course, when you have determined those ideal programs that you should follow, then you need a specialized software, not Excel, to let you automate all of that. We spoke earlier about the issues with manual work and specifically also given the headcount situation the staffing situation that we often see in treasury departments, where this puts an even bigger burden on following the process that is agreed in the program. And therefore, I think what we see here as best practice nowadays is companies really leveraging specialized software that is built for purpose for exactly that complex task of currency management. And if you do all of that, and those companies that do that, they really have their risk fully under control and reduce significantly their operational risk and, of course, the manual workload that is on the desk of the treasurer. If, as a summary of my introduction here, I mean, I really like to use this kind of simple 2x2 matrix. Picture yourself somewhere in there on those two axes of, I have my FX workflow, pre-trade, trade, post-trade, automated to a certain degree. And I know I have really a very effective hedging program given my specific business dynamics. So somewhere in that matrix, with your company, you are positioned there. The goal has to be, from our perspective, to really be in this top right corner where you are able to run the most effective program for your business dynamics in the most automated way. This is, I think, what we're going to discuss and what we want to discuss with you. Okay, so I would love to hand over to my colleague, to Nadia, to give us some more details how this can look like.
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael. So obviously a good kind of synopsis of a lot of the concepts, and we're going to go into a little bit of detail now. So what we're looking at here is kind of the full end-to-end workflow for currency management. And I want to take a minute first to talk about each box you see here. So each process that exists when you're working with currencies and where automation comes into play, or maybe should come into play. So this is going to be the theory, and then we'll have time to go through a few case studies of companies that we've worked with who've moved towards automation to give a bit of color to that picture. So let's start from the very beginning. We're going to start with pricing. Now, there's a real range in pricing processes. So we've seen the smallest companies with quite sophisticated approaches, and at the extreme end, I've seen a listed company where you have the CFO Googling a rate every morning to try and tell it to the commercial department. Another tendency which can cause a lot of tension between teams, which Michael touched on there, is finance telling sales you can only sell in these few currencies. And as a result, being seen as a really restrictive function that's kind of divorced from the competitive requirements of the business, which generally, it's not how we want to be seen, and it's not how we should be seen. Obviously, it is one of the processes where automated systems are readily available, and I would urge you to make sure that your system is doing everything that you need it to be doing. So that may be adding a markup, that might be pricing with the forward rate if that's appropriate if you're going to be hedging. It could be updating according to volatility, not just frequency. It's not necessarily every day that you need to update. And it may be having different rules for different markets. And it's making sure that the treasury team has enough oversight over this to share it comfortably and readily with the sales team. The other issue that we see is that even when a solid kind of automated pricing system is in use, it may just be siloed within the commercial team. Now, if that pricing rate is never communicated to finance, well, it's not going to be protected by the sales team. I mean, that's not their job. So there should be a linkage there between this process and the next. So the next two processes are probably where we tend to see, I would say, the lowest level of automation and a really heavy dependence on Excel. We'll start with the exposure collection. So the exposure information you'll need, as we said before, is going to depend on your business model. So it could be balance sheet items, it could be firm commitments, or it could start way back at forecasting. And you need to know that you're getting that information at the earliest possible moment. Where it's delayed, you're exposed to risk that you cannot possibly control. And you need to know where that information is captured. And you need to be comfortable around the data quality of that information. If it's just getting typed manually into Excel from a download in your ERP, well, then it's very hard to identify line items which may be faulty. So that's one operational risk. And if you have all your subsidiaries reporting their own exposure independently, maybe at the end of every day, possibly even at the end of every week or even later, you don't have what you need to be in control of the risk that your business faces. So the ideal situation is for you actually to be integrated with the systems in which these transactions are being recorded, whether that's an ERP or a booking engine, and you need validation rules that are going to allow you to identify anomalies. And then we come to exposure processing. Now, this is where we tend to have those huge Excel monsters. So maybe one guy built it years ago and he's since left the company and nobody wants to touch the macros because we all just kind of have to hope it's working properly. And I know I've worked with those files. I know that it doesn't feel good. And it doesn't feel good because it's a huge operational risk and it's not how we should be working. And even if it is working right, it's often a bit of a black box and it's bulking a ton of transactions together and spitting out a netted trade recommendation. And if anything changes down the line, say you're shipping something and your container gets stuck in a canal in Egypt, or there's some kind of major global health issue, naming no names, and you're in a position of trying to unwind a part of your hedge where you can't really see where the individual transaction is that it's relating to. You maybe just know what month it's captured in, and you have to deal with all that. And then on top of that, you have to worry about the accounting for it, which we're going to come to later. I don't know if you can tell, but that's my biggest sticking point. The next phase we move to is the trade phase, which I'm much calmer about. This is where your MDP comes into play. And it's really changed things since it came in. It is a great technology. And I'm sure lots of you are working with multi-dealer platforms. The only problem is we can tend to look at that trade execution stage as the single most important part of this workflow. But then, you could be doing a really fantastic job at saving 2 basis points on execution, which is great. It is a great job, but it's kind of for nothing if you've already lost 15 basis points to risk by overlooking this huge pre-trade phase. And then we've got the post-trade section. Now, this is where we again see quite a lot of manual processes, although they are often reinforced by a TMS. So we'll start with the accounting, and in particular, hedge accounting. Now, sooner or later, the regulators are bound to come down on the auditors on IFRS 9, and they will go hell for leather on checking how that's working. And when they do, you're going to want to be really, really clear on proving that you're applying your policy to the letter, that you can trace hedging items back to the specific you can trace the hedging instruments back to the specific hedged items. and that you can generate all that documentation that you need at what is already normally the busiest time of the year for the finance department. So you need to think about what system you have in place for when this happens. But then even before you get to year end, what about your management reporting? This is somewhere where we really see that you can add a huge amount of value if you are able to provide real-time updates on what your exposures are, maybe on the currency impact that's been suffered by a certain market, or profit monitoring for a new production line with the noise of FX totally removed. And this real-time information that can have a huge strategic impact is not what Excel is providing. It's not what it's set up to provide. And then the last box that we have here is your cash flows. And what we really want to see here to put companies into that top right quadrant that Michael showed you is a linkage between your risk management and your cash management processes. So you've got your settlements and you've probably got swaps to adjust and to align your hedges with those settlements. And what you want that kind of adjustment and alignment to be happening. You don't want to end up just sort of settling your hedges and then leaving your AP and AR teams to settle at spot. And that is what we've seen sometimes. And what that means is that you're trading 3 times more than you need. So it's fantastic that you saved 2 basis points with an MDP, but that saving isn't sort of multiplied by 3. You're trading too much. And again, kind of like the pricing, what that comes down to is having a solid system integration between departments, and you need proper tools in order to enable you to do your job the best that you can. And that's kind of the last or the overall point that I want to make on this slide, is that you need a system that can either capture the end-to-end process or that can automatically interface with the other technologies that you're using within it, whether that's an ERP, TMS, MDP, whatever it is, but you need them to be interfaced in order to allow you to kind of push currencies as a competitive opportunity, actually, not just as a headache. I know there's quite a lot captured on there, but before we move on to some examples, Michael, is there anything that you'd like to kind of add to that?
No, I just maybe want to re-emphasize that this distinction between Oh, so sorry, I was muted. I maybe just one emphasis on this trade phase, where we in actual fact we do see a lot of automation there, but only for larger companies. So typically this has really to do with size, with FX volume that needs to be traded. So though typically companies 300, 400, 500 or multiple billions of FX volume in various currencies link their liquidity providers to a trade multi-dealer platform like a 360T was already mentioned. Smaller companies typically don't tend to do that. So here we see still really traditional picking up the phone and dealing with 3, 4, 5 banks at the same time to find maybe the best deal for that hedge that you want to do right now. So I would say for mid-size and smaller companies, I'd say the situation is even worse than for larger companies, because there we can clearly see that the whole process end to end is manual. Whereas for larger companies, trade, post-trade, there is certain degree of automation already in place. And I would like to agree with Nadia here that we really see that the pre-trade phase might be the most important one, because this is where you win or lose. This is where you have your risk really under control by taking the right decisions according to your policy, and by leveraging the exposure information as early as possible that you can have available in your systems. All right, back to you, Nadia.
Thank you so much. That's a great point. A couple of great points there. If we could just switch to the next slide, then what we're going to go through is a couple of case studies. So again, here, just trying to really lend some experience to the theory that we've been discussing and the impact that automation can have. So we'll start here. What we have is we've got a French fresh produce exporter, sorry, and they're updating their pricing on a monthly basis, basically to keep things nice and simple from a treasury point of view. And they were looking at the sales forecast for the month and then pre-hedging what they thought they'd need. With automation, what they were able to do was move to a more dynamic model updating their pricing to be in line with the market and selling in any currency, and hedging those sales immediately to manage the associated risk. And what they saw as a result of doing that was a 12% increase in the sales that they were able to generate in the first 3 quarters of 2020. So you can imagine how that strengthened the relationship with the commercial team, and also, gave then the finance team a little bit of leverage to say, we really need your sales orders to be registered properly. It's really important that these teams understand how they're helping each other out. And on top of that, they reduce their forecasting risk and they reduce their manual workload. That's quite a simple example, but I think it really can show how even in any size of company, there is room for automation to improve your situation and to make it easier at the same time. I know there's not a huge amount of detail there, but Michael, is there anything that you would like to add at this stage before we kind of add layers of complexity to that?
No, I think you described it quite well. I mean, this. So yeah, maybe this point of companies, I made this point earlier. So the point of companies basically taking a strategy of avoiding currencies in order to reduce the complexity to deal with, in order to reduce the risk, it is a strategy that we see a lot. But I think this case exemplifies very nicely that by actually leveraging currencies, so taking exactly the opposite view, using as many as possible in order to realize a business benefit, and this is something we really see across the board in many industries, that selling in local currencies has an impact on conversion rates, has an impact on overall revenue growth. And of course, if you want to adopt and support your business, you need to have a solid foundation. You need to have a systematic approach to currency management in order to enable such a growth. Yeah. All right, I'll give you the next case.
Right, perfect. So the next example is slightly different. These guys are an international chemicals and plastics distributor, and they were already operating a micro hedging program, just doing it manually, and not for a small amount. When we were talking 500 million euro annually, made up of thousands of transactions. So obviously the first step was automating what they were already doing, with huge time savings for the team, not just in the process, but also in identifying errors, cost savings around swapping out errors. It also meant that they were able to start implementing hedge accounting for the first time, with all the efficiency testing, the documentation, the split between OCI and income statement, all driven by automation. The other way in which we saw a huge impact from automation was in reducing delays. So yes, they had chosen the ideal program for their business, absolutely what we would have recommended. And yes, they were doing, I would say, a near superhuman job of applying it manually, but they had subsidiaries in Asia and they had subsidiaries in LATAM. Now, between higher volatility in the exchange rates and the time differences, which were causing almost a 9-hour delay in hedging, they were actually still seeing quite a bit of movement in the rate by the time a trade was executed. So by automating the process and trading 24/7, they were actually able to further reduce their risk while they reduced their workload. So really doing a lot more with a lot less. And in this case, they were actually also initially calling the bank for every transaction that they were making. So they did add an MDP here to benefit from best price execution, to Michael's point earlier. So, again, a situation where they're pricing dynamically, they are aware of the risk that creates and the need to hedge that risk as soon as possible. But there are just limitations by having a person do that where a robot can do it better. Before we move on, Michael, do you have any comment on that? And I see we have taken some questions, but we will address them in the Q&A at the end. So keep them coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great example of a case when you remember my 2x2 matrix, where we would already be in a situation with this company where we are on the top left corner. So they, as Nadia explained, they are applying the right program for their specific business dynamics. but they have the limitations of the human factor in here. And Nadia explained quite nicely the results and the consequences of that. And I think it's the reality for most of you that the treasury teams are not, massively overstaffed, to say the least, and therefore this puts really a burden on you guys, where we see sometimes with companies that they need two treasurers are in the team. They need to align on their vacation periods. If one gets ill, the other can't go on vacation because they have to execute their best program, and they do it manually. So there is a huge burden on the shoulders of the treasurer to actually be able to execute the program that the board has approved in the policy. Yeah. So we see this quite often.
That's a great point. And actually, just to add to that slightly, hopefully a one-off situation, but when we all suddenly started working from home, we did talk to quite a few companies who just suddenly, there was a week or a couple of weeks while they were setting up their systems where they could not execute and where they were just fully exposed to risk. So having those processes that are fully dependent on a person, there's always risk there. So now we move to the third and final case study in this presentation. And the last case is almost the opposite scenario. It's where pricing dynamically actually isn't preferable, where the market demands that you hold your pricing. So Michael spoke earlier about a machinery company where they have a price list for spare parts. What we're looking at here is a fashion company with a spring-summer campaign and an autumn-winter campaign. So what they have is fixed pricing for 6 months, absolutely locked in. Obviously, when we came to them, they were hedging based on forecasts for that campaign. Now, their forecasts were cautious, as they so often are, so they weren't often overhedged, but they were almost always underhedged. And all their revenues, which exceeded forecast expectations, were just fully exposed to volatility. So the first step here was to automate the forecast hedging program, protecting the pricing rate for these forecasted revenues. So far, so straightforward, really. The benefit of automating this was that they could define various outcomes depending on market behaviors, because they could systematically monitor the markets 24/7. So hedge X proportion of my forecast immediately, but if the rate improves by a certain amount, well, then lock in X% more to allow me to beat my rate. Now, obviously, some treasurers are doing this manually, but what we really want to see is it done in a systematic way that's predefined and protected from speculation and from bias. So you don't want to lock in a rate you're feeling good about just because you had a nice walk into the office that morning and things are feeling really positive. You need to have kind of pre-agreed in what situations do I want to lock that rate in. Now, I don't want to go too much into the mechanics of how we do that. It's not the purpose of today's session, but of course, feel free to reach out to me after the webinar if you think that could be relevant to you and you'd like to learn more about how you can do that. The next step for this company was to combine their forecast hedging with real-time updates on their sales by integrating with their ERP system and reducing the forecast risk without giving up on protecting those transactions, which had been the initial kind of solution that was in place. So that's where we were saying before, maybe you have your forecast, maybe it's, you have an update on it every 3 months. Well, it's not because actually that information is updated every 3 months. That's when it's being communicated to you. Actually, there is a system which is containing live updates of sales that are being made, and you need to be able to leverage this system. You already have it in place. You just need to be able to use it in the most kind of efficient and forward-thinking way that you can. And that's what we really see that people need to be doing. Any comments on that last case study there, Michael?
Yes, I would like to emphasize this idea of combining programs here, because this is very powerful. I mean, many of you in the audience here probably have also business models where you need to rely on forecast data, and some of you might be lucky enough to have very accurate and stable forecasts in your business, so you can go with high hedge ratios. And what Nadia described here might not be that relevant for you. But all of those of you where forecast accuracy cannot be guaranteed to a higher degree, this combination of leveraging then downstream information like sales orders, purchase orders, or sometimes even some companies take it even to the max then by also then on top leveraging the invoicing information, which of course is the most, I would say, the most accurate information that you can get, and step by step increasing their hedge ratio with each additional information flowing in and correcting the forecast in that sense. And yeah, so this is absolutely best practice. Of course, puts even more complexity in the process, because now you need to deal with 3 types of input data: forecasts, orders, and invoices, and you need to reconcile all of that constantly. And here is where the beauty and the strength of technology really can be seen in very, very immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, 2 points that I didn't make before. The first on forward points, actually, it wasn't the case for this company, but very often we do see, well, okay, what do I do if I know that I have this situation and I probably should be hedging my forecast, but I have forward points massively against me? Well, you need to be able to monitor the markets and basically have a definition of at what stage does suffering forward points become more important than the risk that I'm facing. So having a kind of a level that's predefined, that's not speculative, that says after this level of volatility is breached, which I can monitor 24/7, at that stage, I need to be hedged. The forward point, saving on forward points by not hedging is no longer a viable strategy. That's something that, kind of to Michael's introduction, where you think about these are all the considerations for my business. If that's a consideration, more than ever, you need to be monitoring the market really carefully. And the second point that I didn't mention, which is actually listed here, is on swaps. If you're taking big bulk hedges around forecasts, you're going to end up needing to swap that out to match your cash requirements as sales are made. And you need to be able to make sure that you have enough granularity and you have enough information pulling through systems that you can tie everything back in a really systematic way. So that takes us to the end. We've received a couple of questions. So I guess I'll do them in order, and then Michael can answer. We'll both sort of tag into these.
Yes.
So perfect. So and we've got 8 minutes. We've got 3 questions. That's about perfect, hopefully. The first question is, but does your case study, and I believe this came in for case study 1, not expose my business to currency movements, which hedging can fix by smoothing? I think there's a couple of things that we think around smoothing for. I think there's when we're smoothing the rate in the first case study, they were kind of giving a fixed pricing rate, so smoothing that within the month, but obviously having a cliff at the end of the month. And there can also be a consideration around smoothing the kind of FX rate for a reporting point of view. This is much more for listed companies where they don't want to have a sudden shock period on period when they're reporting to their investors. So I'm not entirely there. The definition of smoothing in this case can have those 2 implications. In relation to case study 1, I guess it's around the pricing. But Michael, do you?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, the case study 1 was basically switching to a more dynamic pricing, right? So from a static pricing over a certain period to a more dynamic pricing. And yes, if you do that, then you need to adapt a micro hedging approach hand in hand. Otherwise, you are absolutely right that if you don't do that, and then the rate that you hedge is off compared to the rate that you price with. But what Nadia introduced here is the idea that by being able to leverage a more dynamic pricing and then immediately hedging those transactions that are priced with that rate, you have almost the perfect hedge. So that's the best scenario, I would say, that you can have from a hedging perspective, that you basically on a transactional basis are able to secure the margin of that transaction when it is happening. Yeah. Okay, there was a second question where we rely on automated activity what stops fat fingers resulting in hedges being executed with a human eye would have prevented. So that's actually a very good topic, because when we speak about automation, you are absolutely right. There needs to still be levels of control for you. You cannot, in the world we are living in, and with all the complexities, completely rely blind-eyed on automation. And solutions need to give you the option to give you full transparency what's going on. So when I guess with a fat finger you mean maybe putting an invoice in the system that has a 1 0 too many, and all of a sudden you have a 10 million invoice where you normally expect invoices below 1 million. And solutions need to give you the chance to have a kind of a exception handling. So again, rules-based allow you to capture those exceptions and bring them in front of a human eye, as you say, to make you validate them. So a solution needs to give you the functionality to stay in control while automating still, and that's absolutely right. And you are right with that. If we rely on the computer and the rules, what is left for the treasurer to do or learn? Plenty, I would say, yes. That's an interesting question here, because what do you learn by manually doing repetitive tasks? I speak to treasurers where that, based on their business model, they have to do micro hedging, basically what Nadia also had in one of her cases. And literally, those two treasurers spend 2 hours every day just hacking in trade data into a 360T platform. So there is nothing they learn. It's just a lot of manual work, repetitive, and so on. So, but imagine this is being automated, and you can then have the resulting data and analyze it. So actually, you gain time to be able to perform much higher value tasks by not having to do this repetitive work of monitoring currency rates manually through maybe on a Bloomberg, or through looking in the internet, or as we just explained, entering trades manually in various systems.
Can I just add to that as well?
Yes, please.
Great points, but also, I don't use my abacus anymore since I got a calculator. It doesn't make the maths less hard. There's still plenty to be doing. It's just about saying, okay, if I could do this perfectly because I have a robot at my disposal, what would I be doing then that I wouldn't be doing now necessarily?
Yeah.
And what you're going to get as well, if you do automate it, very often is kind of a better high level view of what's going on, which allows you to make better strategic decisions. So where you've got automation, you're going to have reporting, you're going to have analytics, and you're going to be able to monitor really clearly what are the trends that are happening in your exposure, what's going on, rather than trying to look line by line. It's very hard in Excel to make a clear picture out of hundreds and hundreds of entries. So I think that's a really important, it's trusting your treasury department to really be doing all that value add stuff that they need to be doing, especially recently around cash flow forecasting and as well as building the best FX system possible by saying, well, there's new tools in the market, I should be using them.
And what we've also seen actually is that the treasury function becomes more strategic with this. I mean, we had that one case where the treasurer enabled the company to sell in more currencies, and that is a strategic aspect. So being able to talk to your business and say, look, I know we restricted you. You could only sell in 3 currencies because so far. So and if you have a client in a country where with a currency that we don't support, bad luck, you have to sell in dollars. Now you can go and to that same business head and say, look, we can enable you to sell in Thai baht if you want to, if you see business benefit for it, because we have now a system in place that allows us to manage the complexity that comes with it.
Perfect. And just the last question, hopefully it won't take us over the time limit. I know everyone's very busy, but if there is uncertainty on the forecast, is it not considered to use options instead of FX forwards? And absolutely, it's a consideration. The first thing I would say before maybe Michael says something much cleverer is options are more expensive. If you can do something with a system, with automation, you don't necessarily need to pay the bank to bear the rate, to bear the risk. That's what an option is, and that's how it's priced. So if you can do a lot of the logic on your side, you don't need to pay extra for that.
Absolutely, Nadia, and I will never be in a position to say something more intelligent than you. But maybe one aspect where there is one use case where we do see really a good use case for options is, let's say, in long stretch tender situations where you have to submit a price, maybe to a public sector entity, and you have to keep that price for 3 to 4, 5, 6 months, depending on the decision cycle of that entity. And here you are in a situation where the cash flow is highly unlikely. So hedging something like this with a forward, where you basically commit to the hedge, that is maybe a case where options and are a viable tool to use. In a certain way, this is an extreme interpretation of forecast inaccuracy. You have a forecast that can go either black or white. Either you have it 100% or you have 0. So therefore, indeed, if you have extremely unreliable forecast, you have no accuracy at all, which is mostly not the case, then options can be an alternative. But for most companies, we are speaking about a range between 60 to 95% of forecast accuracy. And in that area, I think an approach like we try to outline it today is beneficial just from a pure cost perspective, because those options are quite expensive.
Perfect. And then I know we're a minute over, so the last question that we have so far is, can we do trades for restricted currencies using digital function more easily? I know that we're, as I say, running over time. So yes, there's ways that we can consider that. What I would recommend you do is to email me. You have my email address on screen, and we can talk about your specific situation. And I won't keep the ACT team for too much longer, and hope everyone has a great conference.
Yeah. Same.